So thank you again for joining this afternoon. We do have a great presentation lined up with some of our guest speakers. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen briefly just so that way you guys can see their names. And so yeah, today for our office hours, we're going to have some speakers, going to have both Brad and Weiyi. They're going to talk about our data privacy model for the All of Us Research program. So I'll go ahead and pass it over to them and let them start whenever they're ready.
All right, thanks. Let me share my screen. All right, correct screen. Can you see presentation? Great.
Looks good.
Okay, so I'm Brad Malin, and I'm joined today by Weiyi Xia, and we do a lot of the data privacy policy design and some of the implementation for the researcher Workbench. And so we wanted to give a little bit of intuition into why the system is architected in the way that it is, so that people have better intuition into what you can and can't do with the data. So as most of you are probably aware, but I think it's important to rehash this, it's a tiered model for access to all of us. And the first model the first tier that we had initially disclosed and is out the door is the public tier. And this you can access without logging into the resource. What you find is that it's only summary statistics, and we'll show you what this is in a moment. And then the other tiers you come into through sandbox environments. And we affectionately dubbed these the registered tier. And in the registered tier, this is going to be available to anyone that has a trusted organization who enters into an agreement with us, and you prove your identity, and then you sign agreements. And we'll go through what these are. And then in addition, so at this point, we give you access to individual level records from the participants that we have created in a manner that has a low risk of re-identification. And the other tier, the one that was recently released, is what's called the controlled tier. And this is available also at the present moment in time. This is trusted investigators. There's an expectation that registered tier is going to be opened up on a much broader scale, as you'll see in a moment. But in the controlled tier, you'll get more detailed information, and there is going to be more risk to the participants, but it's still a controlled and measured amount of risk. But it's in that space where we also, the NIH asked us to go off and show that still non-human subjects designation in this environment, which is why you don't need to go get IRB approval in order to get specific, to indicate specifically what you need to be doing with the resource. Though you will need to say what you are doing in the public description space. So public is out in the open. The sandbox environments are sitting out on the Google Cloud platform. All right, so registered and then controlled. Okay, so the public tier has been realized through what we call the data browser. And the data browser gives you intuition into what's in the data, right? So like we have EHR data, we have genomic information, we've got physical measurements, and we've got information coming off of wearables like Fitbits and a bunch of surveys. And so you can drill down into any one of these to get some intuition into what the data is about. This is an example of what happens if you go into the medical concepts, and you can see, for instance, that pain ends up being the highest volume event in the resource as documented in the EHR, on the order of around 155,000 individuals. And so this is just an illustration of a distribution. Now, the reason why it is designed the way it is, and I should explain that it's summary statistics, and what we did was we've rounded all of the results so that it's to the nearest multiple of 20. So you don't get individual specific findings in this environment. And the reason why this was designed this way is to prevent what's called the triangulation problem, where somebody might issue a question where they say, show me somebody with a medical record that has juvenile diabetes, well, that's a bad example, diabetes and a heart attack. And it might come back and say, okay, there's 20 people with that. And then you might issue another query that says, show me everybody with diabetes and a heart attack and they died. And that might come back and say that there's only 10. And in this situation, you can infer now how many patients had diabetes and a heart attack and did not die. And in that situation, it would be 10 again. But you can see how you could overlay queries where you could have a situation where it says, show me X and Y, and it comes back at 16, which looks like it's a decent number of people, but then you issue a related query again, and it comes back and it says, oh, well, that's 15. At which point, now you know that the number of people who had X and Y and not Z is going to be 1. And that would be a unique disclosure. And so this is why we aggregate the data into the nearest multiples of 20 so that you can't do this type of triangulation in the public domain. Okay, so let me skip this part. All right, so this is a further illustration of just how it was realized in practice, where the data was aggregated across the specific ages of the participants in the program. So this is like an example of that type of drill down where you're saying, age at a certain level, and then tell me whether or not they had ALS. Okay, so the tiered approach that we've taken is that it's a combination of various types of protections to mitigate the likelihood that the system would be misused. And I'm going to walk you through these at their different levels. 1 is at the institutional level, 2 is at a contractual level, 3 is at an ethical level, and then 4th is at the technical level with respect to security, and then the 5th will be with respect to data and privacy protections. This is where we are going to be talking about access to the registered or controlled tier at the moment. So institutionally, we have this set up so that a user needs to be affiliated with a US-based academic, nonprofit, or healthcare institution. And at last time I checked, we were over 360 institutions. Individuals do not have the ability to establish a relationship for their organization. There needs to be an institutional signing official that takes that responsibility and enters into the agreement with the program. And this agreement basically says that they're taking responsibility for your actions that you commit while you are working with the resource. Okay, so that's an easier one. At the contractual level, so that is a contract, but what I mean by contract here is a relationship with the individual users. So you may be familiar with the notion of a data use agreement. In this environment, we call this the data user code of conduct, because it's not just about the use agreement. We are asking all of the users of the resource to adhere and agree to adhere to the core values that we have within this program. And that includes that the resource is anticipated to be used for the benefit of society, and that it's not going to be used to target any specific any individuals or conduct any stigmatizing research. So the details for the code of conduct you can find up on the website at the program, but I'm giving you a screenshot of some of the things that you are attesting to. What's notable about this, before I jump off this, is that this really is a contract. It is, in the event that somebody violates the code of conduct, then there's an opportunity for us to hold that specific individual accountable, as well as go back to their institution and work with them to apply the appropriate type of penalization, which I will talk about in a moment. And in addition, everybody needs to undergo what's referred to as RCR, or Responsible Conduct of Research training. And so a lot of you may be familiar with doing human subject certification training or going through city training. But even though this resource is non-human subjects and you're not necessarily subject to doing something like a HIPAA training or a human subject certification training, we still want everybody to have an understanding of why this resource exists, what the participants are expecting and what the program is expecting, and how you should be working in this space. We also require all users to take a test after they go through this training, and you must have a passing grade of 80% or better. Okay, so that's the social contract as it gets established. The next thing is, in terms of protection, is that the entire resource is managed in GCP, as I mentioned, and this is a FISMA and FedRAMP certified environment. And what that means is that the security controls that have been established are considered to be, this is, I should mention, this is FISMA moderate, that this is at a level of protection that the federal government has signed off on and said that they are comfortable with data that is collected using funds from the federal government being stored in this environment. And so we base the entire resource on a piece of technology that's called Terra, which was initially developed in partnership between Verily, which is a subsidiary of Alphabet, and the Broad Institute, among a couple of other institutions. And so Terra provides a number of functionalities that you can use for interacting with the data, but it's all managed from a security perspective in combination with policy administration at the Broad and the technical controls of GCP at Google. In this respect, all the data is stored in what's referred to as a BigQuery environment. This is a key value storage technology that Google introduced about a decade ago. And so it just facilitates better load balancing, but it also has security controls over it with respect to access and audit. All the users, when they access data, you are not directly interacting with BigQuery. Instead, we've built virtualized environments that sit on top of the BigQuery environment that allow people to query the infrastructure or through the data using Jupyter Notebooks and Python or R. I should also notice that the relational database or the SQL language is also being applied for querying BigQuery, but it's coming through either Python or R. It is possible for users to grant other users access to workspaces so that people can collaborate, but this is done on only a agreed upon basis. You can't walk into another user's workspace without that invite being established. We've also designed it such that the data needs to be held in what I alluded to earlier as a sandbox environment. You cannot download any individual level records. And we do monitor for the egress of high data quantities. It is possible for you to download and use aggregated results as well as summary figures. And there's still the expectation that when that is done, that the principle of information not communicating an aggregated result smaller than 20 would still be adhered to. But we do not technically enforce that. This is a policy that we ask all of the users to adhere to. In terms of authentication, we initially built the system under the expectation that users would authenticate through the ERA Commons that was established by the NIH for working with their granting systems. We recognized that this was a bit limiting. And so we recently migrated onto the RAS service that the NIH has been developing. And in particular, we're using login.gov to facilitate the authentication of an individual's identity. Typically, this uses an individual's social security number and other information that can be used for such verification purposes. There is a very small percentage of the user base that either don't have social security numbers or they have problems with the validation of their social security number, at which point this is taken outside of login.gov and is done through a manual process in partnership with the program as well as the individual's home institution. Now, from a privacy perspective, I alluded to the fact that we make some amendments to the data, and this is done to ensure that the risk of re-identification to the participants is sufficiently low to be deemed non-human subjects by the NIH's IRB. And the reason why this is done is really because of this guy. And for those of you that are not familiar with this face, this is Bill Weld. He was the governor of the state of Massachusetts in the 1990s. He was running as a vice presidential candidate a couple years ago. And back in the 90s, before we really had clear guidance on what medical privacy policy and law looked like, we were collecting and sharing data that were making people's records potentially vulnerable to what we call re-identification attack. Specifically in the 90s, there was a movement to collect hospital discharge data on a very large scale to facilitate comparative effectiveness research. And during that time, this was pre-HIPAA. There was a push to collect information about what people were diagnosed with, what the procedures they were subject to, what their demographics were, but also how much did it cost for a particular procedure. So Weld was the governor of the state of Massachusetts at the time. This data started to be collected. And I should note that by the mid-90s, about 45 out of 50 US states were collecting and making this data publicly accessible for a small fee. Weld was receiving an honorary doctorate while on stage, and he ended up collapsing, and nobody knew exactly what happened to him. And an enterprising MIT graduate student said, oh, well, I bet he shows up in the hospital discharge data. Now, what was known was that he had been admitted to Massachusetts General Hospital. They knew when he had been admitted approximately, but they also knew where he lived because that was in the public domain. And so it was also available, you were also capable of getting access to other public resources, what we like to refer to as an identified resource, where you would have the same demographics that existed in the hospital discharge data, such that you could cross this public data. In this case, it was a voter registration list for the city of Cambridge that cost $20 to get access to. And what this student had learned was that he was the only person with his 5-digit zip code, birth date, and gender who was admitted to Massachusetts General Hospital during that time. And so this was a really simple hack, and a lot of people grew very concerned about this. And so if you ever wonder where the HIPAA safe harbor de-identification model comes from, you might not know that name, but I guarantee if you go talk to your IRB and they say the HIPAA identifiers, they pulled that from this attack. HIPAA, when it was promulgated in the privacy rule, they said you can't share 5-digit zip code information, you can't share specific dates, you can't provide any specific information about even the age of an individual if they're over 89 years old. That all came out of this type of a study. And that was because while he was the only person who was re-identified in this attack, it was subsequently shown that most of the United States would be uniquely determined based on their 5-digit zip code, birth date, and gender, which is why we don't make this widely accessible in this resource. What we've seen is that these were attacks that were committed against demographics, and I could show you many different attacks that have been successful over the years. But we've also seen people attacking diagnosis code combinations and health survey responses, and the list goes on and on. And so what I show you is additional information that's not health related at the bottom, because this program is starting to consider integration of our data with data from other resources to investigate social determinants of health. So when we started trying to figure out what information will go into registered tier, what information will go into controlled tier, we began with an initial qualitative re-identification risk assessment where we considered two parts of the equation. We said, what's the chance that somebody could get access to a resource that has a particular type of information about somebody, such as their marital status, or whether or not they are an owner of a home, they're a homeowner, or what their race or ethnicity is. And you can see that those types of information we labeled as high because we were aware that there were resources that just about anybody in the country or world could get access to this type of information. Information that was not as easily accessible was whether or not, what their living situation was, or whether or not they were active duty military, though we know that might occur, it wasn't as readily accessible. We then asked the second question of, so what's the chance that somebody in that identifiable resource, that information would exist within that resource? And you see that you'll notice there's a little bit of a change when you get into the middle area here, where annual household income, it's not easy to get access to, but this information could exist within this resource. So we looked at the combination of these two factors to try to get a handle on what we should prioritize for claims that a pragmatic adversary or misuser of the resource might attempt to exploit. And so as we were doing this, we got questions around, so how does this relate to how people do privacy protections under HIPAA? And what I think people should be aware of is that under HIPAA, there is that safe harbor I alluded to that said that remove these 18 identifiers and show that there's no chance that or no residual knowledge that somebody could be used to could be identified in that data. But that was only one way in which the privacy rule gave you the ability to do de-identification. And the alternative was that you did what was called an expert determination that said apply generally accepted scientific or statistical principles to show that the risk of identification is low. And this is what we've done, and we're in the midst of developing that paper at the moment, but it has not been published yet. One thing that you should recognize, though, is that the All of Us research program is not subject to HIPAA, but many IRBs are familiar with this notion of safe harbor because it's very straightforward to implement, and they tend to use it within their own space to achieve compliance with the common rule. But it's important also to recognize that this is not devoid of its risks. There are always going to be chances that people could be identified, and really what we're just trying to do is mitigate the risk overall. But the registered tier itself, this goes above and beyond safe harbor to minimize risks, as I'll show you in a moment. So these are the general changes that were made to the data within the resource, and I will stop presenting soon, but I want to give you some intuition to this. You'll notice that with dates in the registered tier, we randomly shift the dates on a per participant basis within the period of 1 year. We also generalized their geolocale of where they reside to the level of US state, provided there were at least 200 people who are participating from that state. We didn't change things like marital status or whether or not they rent or own. We didn't change whether or not they were born in the US or not. But we did make some edits to race, sex, and sexuality, as you'll see in a moment. We also dropped out the specific cause of death. What exactly the genomic data is not in the registered tier. We removed all incidents with respect to motor vehicle accidents, as those are typically publicly reported and can be used for identification purposes. And at the moment, we don't give out free text. So this is the registered tier. You'll notice the controlled tier is really a more specialized version of the registered tier. We give out real dates of events. We will reveal the year of birth of the individual, and we will reveal the date of death of the individual. And in this respect, we're compliant with the common rule, and we're not exactly consistent with how HIPAA requires privacy protection to be offered. But you'll notice that we made a lot of things more available. The only things that we didn't make available were the motor vehicle accidents and the free text data that came out of the medical record at the moment. So a little bit more, well, that was already explained. So specifically what we did was we shifted all of the dates backwards between -1 and -365 days, but you can still look at temporality on a per patient basis. And in the registered tier, it's also important to note that we remove participants once they reach over the age of 89. So we get questions about, so what did we do with respect to race and ethnicity? And one of the main changes was that when we did our last release, we did not have enough people who were of Middle Eastern or Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander descent to reveal their information at the same level of specificity as some of the other subpopulations. We also did not reveal information about American Indians or Alaska Natives because we were still in discussions with the representatives of those groups about whether or not we could include them. Our anticipation is that they are going to go into this generalized group, but at the present moment in time, they're not in the resource at all. We also made some amendments to the sex of the individual. Intersex individuals are reported as being an unknown status with respect to sex. We also made similar types of amendments to gender identity. Again, this is only done in the registered tier. It is not done within the controlled tier. Similar things with respect to sexuality. We report straight and other. And these are examples of additional amendments we needed to make to the diagnosis codes that were within the patient's medical records that were contributed so that we didn't have a leakage of that type of information. We also made some amendments to the education level because there was some small numbers in here with respect to people who had lower educational attainment as well as very high levels of educational attainment. And then we also grouped specific information about employment into whether or not they were employed or self-employed, or if they were just in somewhere else within the workforce. And then we also made some amendments for known diagnosis codes that could easily be exploited due to public events. This doesn't mean that we don't tell you if somebody dies. We're just not going to tell you like the specific reason for their death. We did not want to disclose if somebody committed suicide in the resource at the present moment in time. We also didn't want to disclose if somebody had an extended stay in weightlessness because we didn't want to tell anybody if there was an astronaut, particularly in the program. And so I alluded to vehicle accidents before. So finally, there is this question of, so what happens if somebody violates the terms of service or the DUCC or the DUC? And at the moment, we really haven't had a situation that we have had to come out with a formal policy on this for. So at the moment, we are planning on dealing with violations on a case-by-case basis. We believe that we have several different strategies that we can use for penalization purposes. If initially we could say that we will shut people's access to the resource down, but since this is a federal sponsored environment, there is a potential that individual could lose their federal funding, or the institution that they work at could lose their federal funding, and they could be prohibited from receiving future funding. We do not have the ability to affect an individual's employment, but this is why we enter into an agreement with the institution, and the institution is then responsible for handling specifically how they will handle an employee's violation of terms. So that's it. I just wanted to give, well, it probably took longer than expected, but hopefully this gives some intuition into the types of protections that we've put in the program.